I'll be your moderator during this session. I will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat box, so feel free to ask any questions during or after the presentation. The presentation you're about to see is pre-recorded, and Benjamin will be live after the presentation to answer any questions you have. Okay, let's get started.
Hello, thank you so much for attending the session. Before we get started, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Benjamin Xu. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Microsoft Health team. We provide the FHIR API service and other related services in managed service and open source release. My topic today is a close look at two development approaches to interacting with FHIR APIs. It's a long title, but essentially I want to discuss two different ways of working with FHIR data. And I'll discuss the pros and cons with each option. Because this is a short presentation, I will focus on the approaches and some code snippets. A bit of background. I worked on a project for a few months, where the goal was to synchronize data between the FHIR API and a relational database, a two-way data exchange. Because we only had to work with a set of FHIR resources and a subset of FHIR data elements for each FHIR resource type. We did not use any conversion tools available in the market. Rather, we defined the mappings between two data systems and created Azure functions or microservices to accomplish the goal. The first approach was to use FHIR path. It worked, but we met with some challenge. So we looked at another approach, which was to use JSON path instead. I should mention that the C# code here was tested using Azure API for FHIR, a managed service from Microsoft, which actually uses FHIRless HL7 FHIR packages to provide FHIR APIs. And our code relies on the APIs. So first, let's look at one mapping example for the patient FHIR resource using FHIR path. On the left side, you will see the database field called email address 1. On the right side, you see the FHIR path, which, as you can tell, is not a single field. The email value is embedded in the telecom element. I should mention that the mappings for our project were stored in database tables, which allowed us to use existing RESTful APIs the database platform provides. Alternatively, they can be stored in any database or text files as long as you can access them in the application. Here are some code snippets using FHIR path. On the left side, we initiate the FHIR client and add the access token in the authorization header. On the right side, we instantiate a patient resource, a POCO object. Call the extension method iTyped element in the static class. POCO navigate extensions. Use the scalar FHIR path method to find the value of the email and assign it to the database field. If you are familiar with FHIR element method and a FHIR path, this is relatively easy to do. Now let's look at how we'd assign the email value from the database to the FHIR resource. First, we create a patient object and then enumerate the telecom array of type contact point. If we find a match where system is equal to email, we update its value. If no match is found, we add a telecom array element with type contact point and set the value to email value from the database. There may be a better way of doing this, but I use the for each statement to do two tasks. One is to update the email value where a match is found. Another one is to add an array element when no match is found. As you can see from the simple patient example, it is relatively easy to update or create a database record from a FHIR resource. However, it takes much more effort to update or create a FHIR resource, and there is quite a bit of hard coding. And the code depends heavily on the data structure of a FHIR resource type, such as patient. Again, there may be some better options that I'm not aware of, but I know the FHIR JSON path provides another option. So let's take a look at it. First, we define the mappings using JSON path. In the patient email example, the FHIR path is S. The first part is S, which is to select the value. The second part is C, which is to create the J object. P is a parent property, telecom in this case. The square brackets indicate a J array. 0 means the first array element. A is attributes. The percentage symbol is a placeholder, and it will be replaced with the actual value in the code. As you can see, we add more information to the mapping detail. This is very useful when we needed to create JSON properties, such as email, that do not exist in the FHIR resource. Here are some code snippets using JSON path. We use the selected token method and a JSON path defined in the mapping to find the email value and assign it to the database field. Again, it is relatively straightforward. Now, updating or creating a FHIR resource is not so straightforward, but fortunately, we have more information defined in the mapping detail that can help us complete the task. First, if the JSON path is found, we use the replace method to update the email value. Second, if the JSON path is not found, but it's a top-level property, or if its parent property exists, we just create the property and add it to the FHIR resource J object. Now, if the parent property is not found, then it gets a little bit more complicated. We will have to add the parent property first, in this case, telecom, and then J object containing system and email value. In some cases, we will need to add one or more additional children properties prior to adding the property itself, but it's just a matter of working with J objects in your code, which I don't really have it here. As you can see, with JSON path, particularly with additional mapping detail, you can update or create FHIR resources. One nice thing about this approach is that it relies on the mapping, and the same code works for all FHIR resource types. No hard coding involved. In summary, we discussed how to use two different approaches, FHIR path versus JSON path, to update or create database record with FHIR resource, and vice versa. You can work with either approach, but the coding complexity and implementation detail vary. In our project, we decided to use JSON path, and it worked really well. Here is my contact information. Thanks again for joining me in the session. We now open for Q&A.
Thank you, Benjamin. Let's proceed now to the Q&A section.
Okay, thank you, Roy.
Okay. Yeah. All right. First question. How does creation of a plan work? Do you select from a set of predefined building blocks, activities, for example? Can you then parameterize those, for example, 30 minutes versus 1 hour walk?
Let me see if I understand the question here. As I said in this code, so maybe we can clarify the question a bit. But if I understand it, the key is define the mapping when you do the data conversion from the FHIR resource to database, vice versa. So specifically, I think, let me see if I can understand the question. So if the attendee is on the line, maybe you can clarify a little bit, either by typing it, or maybe you can just ask a question through the audio.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I see they've got, the question was actually put into place, and it was actually for another session.
Okay.
Let's just have a look again if there are any.
Yeah, that's why I don't really quite understand.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. We just want to make sure we answer the question better.
Yeah. Okay, has anyone got any questions they want to ask Benjamin?
No, this is the last session.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, we don't seem to have anything else. Any questions, any new questions? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, we've got one question from Alexander. Why did FHIR not work for you while JSON path did?
Yeah, I think as I said in the recorded presentation, it did work for us, but because we need to do a two-way data sync, the way I did it, requires some hard coding, and I didn't really feel like that's the best way of doing that. I think Marianne had a good session on the FHIR path. Using FHIR path, it's most read-only. When you need to update the FHIR resource, that is a bit of a challenge. As I showed, through the sample code, yes, you can make it work. The way I showed it, maybe not the best option, but I think you still can. So basically, both approaches work. It's just, I think it works differently. The way I did it with the JSON path, as I mentioned, I added more detail in terms of how these two resource objects are mapped to each other. And with that additional information, I was able to create, using the J object, create these missing value. Email is the one example. So I will be able to basically add that, object, J object, and then using the FHIR API to update the resource or create the resource. So that's the difference. As I mentioned, with the JSON path, one advantage I found was that I didn't really have to worry too much about, whether it's a patient, whether it's a observation, whether it's encounter, etc. So it's the same code that can work for all, each and every resource type. Where in the way I did it, again, it may not be the best option, that it requires, me to, as a developer, know the resource type. And then based on the information, I kind of figured out how, I would construct the missing node, for example, right? The email in this example, then I will have the value, added to that J object and then updated the FHIR resource. So again, both options work, but I just found it a little bit easier to work with the JSON path.
Okay, super, thanks. Yeah, the next question, are there any limitations in mappings using the FHIR path or JSON that may require using another approach?
Yes, there are some limitations. Good question. Because if you look at the database, structure versus FHIR defines a very rich schema. If you look at patient, that's probably one of the simple resource types. But when you look at for example, even the names, there's another level, sort of after the embedded data structure. So whereas on database side, it's really a single field. For example, if you look at address, you can have multiple addresses in a file resource, even names, you can have, multiple names, right? But in the database that may only have one field called last name and one field called first name. So when you do the mapping, there is a limitation in that because you have only, one field. But obviously you can create multiple fields. So that, to me, that's the limit, one of the limitations that you need to work with. But in terms of the way you define the mapping, once you set up the data structure, if you have a way to change that, in my case, we can even change the data structure because we're using the existing data platform. But if you can change the database, then I think you can overcome some of those limits. But in terms of coding, once you define the mapping, that shouldn't really require another approach, if I understand the question.
Okay, super, thanks. Any other questions that someone wants to ask? Benjamin? We've got another 3 minutes left of this session.
Yeah, one thought I want to share, if we have other questions, is that this is a very common issue that we need to deal with when we needed to convert the file resource to other formats, vice versa. So as I mentioned, there are many conversion tools available, so you can certainly leverage some of those instead of creating something of your own. But to look at how you would convert the data, so you can certainly look at a file path versus JSON, just to get a feel of that yourself.
Okay, super, thanks. No new questions yet. Okay, we still got another 2 minutes left. So, yeah, it looks like we've covered all of the questions, Benjamin. Is there anything else you want to cover up before we wrap up this session?
No, I think it's good. Thank you, everybody, for attending the session. You have my contact information in case you have other questions. Feel free to reach out to me through email.
Okay, super. Thanks, Benjamin. We hope everyone found the session useful. Please do not forget to rate the presentation and use the Q&A function if you still have questions later on. Thanks for attending and have a good day. And we'll see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for your help, Lloyd.
No problem.